In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use your Shure SM7B to get that Joe Rogan podcast sound. So we're going to be emulating this sound right here.
These ideas, even though you think of them.
Right. And we're going to use our SM7B, which we already have a track right here. And it's raw right now. These ideas, even though you think of, and we're going to turn it into this. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. So obviously our voices are different. So there's going to be differences in the tone, but that's pretty much spot on. Now at the end of the video, I'm going to show you 2 other plugins you can use to make your audio sound even better than the Joe Rogan podcast audio. So let's go ahead and get started here. Things you need. Now, obviously, you're going to need a Shure SM7B microphone. That's what Joe uses. That's what a lot of the podcasters use. And you're going to need an audio interface and or a preamp that can provide enough gain for the Shure SM7B. The Shure SM7B requires a lot of gain. I mean, a lot of gain, more gain than most dynamic microphones. The Shure SM7B needs at least 60 dB of gain. Okay. So you're probably going to be using a preamp, even if your interface can drive, 60 dB of gain. And that's because whenever you take your gain all the way up, now this doesn't happen on every audio interface, but it happens on a lot of them. Whenever you're pegging this all the way to 10, you get preamp noise. And you can actually hear preamp noise in Joe's signal right here. This is preamp noise. This preamp noise and of course room tone at the same time there. Sort of that high-end fizzy sound that lives on top of your audio. You don't want that. So unless your audio interface is going to be able to drive 65 plus dB of gain for your mic inputs, you will probably be wanting a preamp. Now I'm using a cloud lifter, and that's going to give me an extra 20 to 25 dB of gain. And that's what we used to record this little sample right here with our SM7B. We had a PreSonus Studio 1824C audio interface, which has about 65 dB of gain, but we also use the cloud lifter, so that way I don't have to peg my my gain, and that way I get a nice clean signal. You can tell in this signal here. Let me bypass this. These ideas, even though we don't have all that fizzy sound on top. So you can use any kind of preamp that you want. It can be a tube preamp, although tube preamps are usually going to add some sort of girth to the sound. It's going to make it a bit warmer. So you'll probably want some sort of a solid state preamp, okay? Or of course a cloud lifter, and links to everything I use for the video will be in the description below. Now what I'm going to show you here isn't the exact plugins that Joe is using or the exact audio interface. You don't need the exact interface or the exact plugins, but you can find a list of those online if you are interested. So let's go ahead and dig in here. But before we do, one more thing. You're going to notice on this track right here, you might say, hey, that's a stereo track, and what you're using here, well, that's a mono track. Well, the truth is, the Shure SM7B and your voice, those are mono instruments. So your voice is a mono instrument, a microphone is a mono source, okay? So if you see this and you say, well, that's a stereo and this is mono, well, actually this is mono as well. Okay, it's just, of course, exported into a stereo bus, and that's going to give us the stereo audio file. So to show this for people who are brand new, we'll look here at a sound field. Now, even though it's panned 100% hard left and 100% hard right, when I play back,
These ideas, even though you
can see the sound field is right down the middle. So if we look at our recorded audio right here, these ideas, even though you can right down the middle. Now, if you look at something like music, so here's some music right here, which is of course a stereo file and panned hard left and hard right. In this case, you're going to see this stereo field all filled up. Okay, so just because something looks like a stereo file doesn't mean it's taking up the entire sound field. And for a podcast, you don't want that. Again, for people who are brand new, if you have 2 people on a podcast, you would not pan one voice right and one voice left. It's going to sound weird. Pan it right down the middle. Unless you're doing like a movie where you need somebody off in the distance off to one side, that's really about the only time you're going to be panning, the human voice way off, to one side. So now let's look at our recorded audio file right here. Now, as you can see, I recorded it with pretty good levels. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, okay? And maybe they're not all maxed out. Now, I've already applied a little bit of gain to this, a little bit of clip gain, just about 3 dB, just to make it a little bit louder. So as long as you've recorded with proper preamp gain, you shouldn't really have to come in here and really mess with your audio file, okay? So I've already applied about 3 more dB of gain to this file here. All right, you could normalize it if you want, but we don't need to really pull it all the way up. So let's look at this file here now. And let's see on this analyzer exactly what it looks like. And then we'll get into shaping our audio file.
These ideas, even though you think.
So look at this low end right here.
These ideas, even though you think of them.
You can see that there is a roll off somewhere around 120 or so, maybe 130. Pulling out that low end so it doesn't get too booming.
These ideas, even though you think of them.
And you can see there's a lot of content up here between 250 and 500. There's a bit of a dip around 1,000, and there's a lot of content up here in the upper end from 2,000 all the way up to about 9,000.
These ideas, even though you think of them.
So we're going to emulate that on our EQ, and I'm going to be using Nectar 3. Now, you don't have to use Nectar 3. The reason I like to use it is because I have my gate, my de-esser, my EQ, and my compressors all within one interface, and I can always make presets here. So I have a preset right there. I just select that preset, and boom, I'm ready to go with that preset whenever I want. But I will show you towards the end of the video how we can do the same thing with a bunch of separate plugins, okay, and even with something like a channel strip. So let's start here with the gate. Let me turn this on, and for now, I'm going to bypass all of my other modules. Now, the gate Joe is using isn't that aggressive, as you can see up here. So what a gate's going to do is going to pull down the audio, the level of the audio, in an area that's sort of silent. Okay, we'll see that right here.
Think of them as.
So it's not really aggressive. We're going to emulate that down here. So here is, let's find an area that, this is pretty good right here, just this beginning part. These ideas, even though you think of them, these ideas, you can see the way I have my gate set right now, it's pulling down that audio in like this area here. You can see it's pulling that down. Whereas if it was off, you're hearing that breath. Now again, his gate isn't that aggressive. I'm a little more aggressive in here, and you may not want to use a gate at all. If I didn't have the gate on at all, and you listened to that, these ideas, even though you think of them as, right, now turn it on. These ideas, even though you think of them as, say, we're getting silence, or at least lower levels in these areas here that we're taking breaths or not speaking, right? So my settings for my gate, and of course you can use other gates, is not that aggressive. It's only about 3 to 1. My attack is pretty late, you know, about 3.3 milliseconds, and I'm holding it here on my release for quite a while. Okay, about 12 milliseconds or so. Now, for those who don't know how a gate works, let me pull this way up here. You can see it's cutting off that audio because it's not going over our threshold here. So as I pull this down, these ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. Now, this is too aggressive right now. If we just look at an area here, for example, just grab this area where there's not really much going on, right? Just background noise. If I look down here on my trace, I can see how high that level is. If I pull it down here, you're hearing it. If I pull it up here, we're closing that gate down. As you can see, we're cutting it off. Now, if I pull my ratio down, we're also hearing it. I pull it up, we start pulling that out. So I don't want to pull a ton out. I'm not going to go crazy here. Just about 3 or so. That's good. We can adjust our close. I don't want to pull it all the way down. That's okay right there. So that's a pretty good level right there for our gate. These ideas, even though you think of them, now again, on Joe's gate, if he's even using one, it's not very aggressive.
You think of them as...
Right, it's not very aggressive at all. So we're going to go ahead and use a gate. You don't have to if you don't want to, but we're going to set that right there. So next up is our de-esser. And a de-esser is going to, of course, take out those S sounds. So let's listen to this here with it bypassed. These ideas, even though you think of them, right? These ideas. So let's turn it on. And essentially with a de-esser, they're essentially all the same. We're choosing the area that we're going to focus on. So usually somewhere between, 25 and, or, 2.5, maybe up a little bit higher. It really depends on where you're getting those S sounds at. Let's just start around 3, I guess, and we'll adjust our threshold here. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain, these ideas, so pull it down here. These ideas, you can see, even though what it's cutting out. So if I just go to listen mode, we can hear those S's that are getting cut out. Now I don't want to go way down here because it sounds awful. These ideas, right? It's just too much. These ideas. We don't want to kill our S's. We just want to tame them. All right. So around here should be good. These ideas. Bypass it. These ideas, right? These ideas. Much better. Even though you give myself a little bit more room on that. These ideas. All right. So there is our de-esser. On to our real tone shaping here. And this is our EQ. So I'm actually going to go ahead and turn on the compressor right now just to bring our level up a bit so you can hear that. With it off, these ideas, turn it back on, these ideas, makes it a little bit louder for us just so we can hear this a little bit more. So once again, as we already saw up here with our analyzer,
these ideas, even though you think of them as,
this is sort of the curve that we want to emulate. So if we look here at our audio file, and let me actually pull up an analyzer on our master track here. So you can see this here. We'll pull up the spectrum. So we can see this here on our audio file. Again, right now the EQ is bypassed. So look here at the low end. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, you see how high that is there in the low end versus this?
These ideas, even though you think of them.
So for a podcast, you may not want that much low end. I actually prefer a little more low end, but in this video, we're trying to emulate this sound here. So we're gonna go with that. All right. So what we need to do is turn on our EQ, and I'll show you what I'm doing here with all of our different bands here. So right now, everything is set up about how it should be. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain. All right. So on our low end here, we have a high pass. We're pulling this out all the way up to about 130. I pull this down here. These ideas, hear that low end? So pull it up. These ideas, even though you think of them as something we're cutting out that low end. That's what we're doing. So what I found is about 130 or so is about where it would need to be. These ideas, again, down, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it. Okay. Then for our next band, and this is optional, it really depends on the tone of your voice. But on our Rogan track, there's a lot of information down here between 200 and 500 or so. So I have a bell shape here, okay? In the Nectar, we have a bunch of different shapes we can use. Just understand if you're using a different EQ, you would just choose a bell shape, okay? So I'm pulling in a little bit down here, and that's this area right here. Let me come back up here. These ideas. So this range right here. These ideas. I pulled it down. Even though you think of them as something still sounds okay, but it's a little closer to our source track if we pull it up just about 1.7 dB or so. These ideas, even though you think of them, then over here, we have, again, a little bit of an increase on around, 350 or so for the same reason, because there's a lot of that content in this track here.
These ideas, even though right?
these ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. Okay. Now you're going to have to play around with this for your own voice. So I can't show you the exact areas. You're really going to have to play around with your own voice. So I'm just going to pull a tiny bit of that in. Now our next band is something I'm pulling out that is actually not pulled out in our source material up here. So this band right here, these ideas, even though you think of them, is sort of boxy in my opinion. Now I would actually probably pull a little bit of this in or just leave it flat if I was trying to emulate this 100%, but for my voice, I like to pull a little bit of this out. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is just a bit. Now this note up here is currently turned off, but again, if I wanted to emulate this sound exactly, I would have this bell on around 700 and pull a bit of that in. Now hear that. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. Now, personally, I would actually pull this out. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, but it's more authentic if I actually pull it in, as you can hear.
These ideas,
up here.
even though you think of them,
because there's a lot of content down there in the Rogan settings. These ideas, even though you think of them as something, so that's up to you whether or not you want to pull some in around, around 700. Now up here is also something for personal taste. And for those who don't know how to EQ, let me touch on that real quick. Essentially what you do for EQ, we're going to find our bell shape, okay? And we're going to have a pretty tight bell and pull this bell tight, as you can see. So we're not affecting so many frequencies. What you would do is you would boost, and it's sometimes called the boost and twist method because you often have knobs that you're twisting, but you boost and sort of scan for the frequencies that are annoying. So we'll do that here. These ideas, we'll boost it, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. Now this area right here is very annoying, which is why I have a node right here. These ideas, okay? So I'll get rid of this band here, and we'll just use the one I already have. So what I'm doing here is this annoying frequency right here. These ideas, even though you think of them as, I'm actually pulling a bit out, and I'm using a dynamic EQ on this here. And what a dynamic EQ is going to do is it's only going to pull that frequency range out whenever it's above our threshold, and we can control that over here. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. So right now it's not pulling any out. These ideas, pull it down, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world. So when you have ideas, whether ideas that turn out to be art, all right. So I like that a little bit better for my voice because it's a little bit harsh in that area. And then up here at the top end, again, because we have quite a bit of top end information up here.
these ideas, even though you think of them.
So we're pulling a bit of that in up here as well. I'm using an analog high shelf for this, a pretty wide bell there, or pretty wide, pretty wide range. I'm pulling that up just about 1.6 dB. If it was down here, these ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world. So that's pretty good right there. Now my gate was a little bit too high there, I think. We'll pull it down a little bit more. Okay, so we're about set up here with our EQ. Again, the main thing is going to be that low end. Is going to get you that, that Joe Rogan sound, is pulling that out and then working here in your 250 to 500 range, and then carving out, areas that just sort of stick out for your voice or the room that you happen to be in. Now, the voiceover you're hearing right now, I actually don't set it up like this at all. I actually have this pulled down much further. I have a few more cutouts in this area because I personally like that sound better, but we want to be authentic to how to get this sound, and this is how you do it. Again, EQ off. Hear it one more time. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. Okay, not bad. Let's turn it back on. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. Much closer to this here.
These ideas, even though you think of them.
Okay, on to the compressor. What our compressor is doing is it's leveling out our track. So if we look here at our audio right here, you can see that we have a lot of peaks and then a lot of valleys. So high ranges of volume and then much lower. If we look at the Joe audio up here, you can see it's much more level. The peaks aren't nearly as high and the valleys aren't nearly as low, as you can see here versus say here. Okay. Now, I've already rendered a track out compressed, which is right here. Let me squeeze this one down so you can see both of them at the same time. So this audio here is the exact audio we have here, except this audio here has been compressed. So if we look at this area here, right there, you see how our peaks are way up here, our valleys are down here, our peaks are here, our valleys are down here. So the peaks and the valleys are more compressed, and we're not going to have such a large dynamic range, which would be, the difference between somebody talking loudly and then sort of coming down and whispering. So we use compression to level all of that out, because it's going to be annoying to your listener if they have to continually juggle their volume. So that's what we're using compression for. And compression also imparts a bit of a sound as well. So this would be the difference here: compressed and then natural. So let's get into our compressor here. We already have it turned on, and I'm using a digital compressor. Now, the reason I'm using a digital compressor is because digital is very transparent. It's not adding any noise, any color, any thickness, or anything like that. All right. So you can use digital, maybe solid state, maybe even optical, in my opinion anyway. We are going to use a vintage style for our second compressor to give it some of that warmth and a little bit more girth. So I'll start off with my threshold way up here. These ideas, and I'll start pulling it down. Even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe you can see as I pull it down, you can see here on the trace exactly what's happening. So I don't want to squish this, right? I don't want to remove any dynamic range at all. These ideas, even though you think of them as, because that sounds awful, right? So we just want to sort of get those peaks and level everything out. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it. So you can see what's happening here to those peaks. And I'm being a little more aggressive than I am on this voiceover audio. I'm being a little more aggressive here because I really want to level things out for the podcast listener. So in this case, probably about -15 is pretty good. Now for our ratio, I'm not going crazy here, only about 4:1. So 4 dB in, about 1 dB out. So then for our attack, how quickly is the compression going to start? And I'm going, about 3.8 milliseconds. Could be a little bit faster, but I'm fine with this setting here. For our release, that's how long is that compression going to hold on? And I'm holding it on pretty long, about 46 milliseconds. Then for our makeup gain, now because a compressor is reducing our overall dynamic range, which means essentially our overall volume, because we're saying 4 dB in, 1 dB out, we have to make up for that with our makeup gain right here. So essentially, again, what that does, as you can see, if we look at quiet areas up here, so let's find a quiet area. So this is kind of quiet right here at the end. You can see what happens once we compress that. Okay. So this area here is the same exact area here after it's been compressed. So it's much more level, and those peaks are lower, and then the lower volume is higher overall. So that's what it's doing. It's again pulling down those peaks, and then because we use our makeup gain, we're pulling up those lower level sounds. So I'll pull our makeup gain down a bit first. It can manifest itself and pull it in the real world. So when you have ideas, whether ideas that turn out to be art or music, okay, just pull that into a good level. I'm not trying to really squash this or to really hit it hard. It can manifest itself in the real world, right? I don't want to do that. I just want to make it so it's about to where it was and maybe a little bit louder. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. If I bypass it, these ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, these ideas, even though and then this is optional. We're going to use a second compressor. And the second compressor is just to grab those peaks, just a little tiny bit more. And in this case, I'm going to use a vintage compressor, again, just for a little bit of that sort of warmth that comes from sort of that tube sound, but just a bit, right? So play that. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. So as you can see, we're not really pulling that much down. We're just leveling it out a little tiny bit more. And same settings here, our ratio, our attack, not much on the ratio, just a bit, about 3-to-1 or so. Kind of a slow attack on that, long release, and a little bit extra makeup gain to pull up our levels a little bit more. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. So if I bypass that compressor, these ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world. There we go. So that's much better. It's a little bit thicker, a little bit more full, and it's also a bit more even across, okay? A little bit more even, as you can see down here, which is, again, our rendered compressed track. More even across our highs and our lows. So that's pretty much it. Now, here in Nectar, we have the option of the ALM, which I've had on this whole time. That means the auto level mode. Now, if you know anything about, Wave's vocal writer, this is kind of like that. It's pretty cool to actually have this built in. You can just turn it on or off. And all this is doing is pulling up our raw audio level. It's pulling it up first and leveling it around about minus 6.1. Now, you don't have to use this. It still sounds fine. It still sounds fine without it. Ideas, even though you think of them as, right, level it out. Ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, it's just a little bit more level overall when we're using the ALM. And you don't want to take this all the way up, okay? Want to give ourselves some room. So about there is pretty good for us, okay? Of course, go through here and tweak things however you need to, because the tone of your voice is, of course, going to be different from mine, different from Joe's, and you're going to have a few different settings in here, especially for your EQ, right? If you have a certain annoying range of your voice, again, click to put in a node, or just, of course, choose it in your EQ, boost that area, and then sweep around to find those annoying frequencies, and then, cut them out, okay? So we're pretty much done here with our compression. Ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world. So there we have it, all set up as our gate, our de-esser, our EQ, compression 1 and compression 2. Now there's also a limiter on, and the limiter here in Nectar works a little bit differently from other limiters. This here just places a cap right on top of our level there, okay? So I pull it down. Ideas, even though you think of them as it's going to limit it, your brain's creating, and maybe, so it's going to limit it wherever I put this. So I just want to make sure I'm not going to peak. Okay, so give myself about a good dB of headroom there. Now other limiters work like this here, where these ideas, as I pull down the threshold, it ends up getting louder. Then we put our ceiling right here, and our ceiling is where the level will not go over, okay? These ideas, even though you think of them, so C limiting, you can actually see limiting in this file right here. Pull it down. If I expand our waveform, you can see how it's been limited all across here, and nothing goes above this area. So it's been capped off, as you can see, all right? But that's what we have here in Nectar, is we're just placing a cap on that with our limiter turned on, all right? So that's everything there to get that Joe Rogan sound using Nectar 3 here from iZotope. And let's compare it again with the original. Again, keep in mind the tone of our voices are different, so of course there's going to be some differences there. And we also have a gate, and his gate is very, very light, if he's even using one.
These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe
these ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. Back up here.
Yeah.
But maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world.
Uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world. So there we go. Essentially the same overall tone, the same overall sound. Obviously, again, the voices are different, but that's about how you would go setting it up. And also, again, to be technically accurate, this would also be off. Even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, right?
You think of them as something your brain's creating. And maybe your brain is creating it.
Because he's got more of this sort of high mid in his voice, so it's coming through a lot more. Even though you think of them as something your brain's create, but again, for me personally, I don't like it, so I like to pull it out just a bit. Even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. So there you go. That's how you would get that Joe Rogan podcast sound using any combination of plugins, but we're using, of course, Nectar 3 here in this case. Now, let's move on to using separate plugins, and I'm just going to go over this really quick here. So I've already emulated that sound with a string of, in this case, Waves plugins right here. So as you can see, we have our gate right here. Again, don't have to use a gate if you don't want, but look at this here. Even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, you can see how that audio is getting pulled down with our gate right here. All right. And then we're using a separate plugin. We're using Sibilance for our S sounds. That's all the S sounds there. Even though you think of them as something your brain, then we're using Q10 for our EQ. It's set up a little bit different, but it's essentially the same thing there. You can see we're going up to about 107 here, and we're pulling that down with our shelf there, okay, or a high pass there. Now, one thing I will mention up here on Nectar again is I'm using a 12 dB per octave shelf, right? If I took this way up, right, to a 48 dB per octave, and you heard that, even though you think of them as something it's really getting cut off. So I use about a 12 dB shelf. You might want to try a 6. Even though you think of them as, but that's actually more low end than you actually have in the Rogan podcast. So a 12 dB shelf works pretty well. So back to our Waves track here with our separate plugins. Here's our EQ again. If I bypass the EQ, think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. Hear that low end? Turn it back on. Think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain. Then we're using a compressor here. Think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world. And then a limiter on this track. Now, if you're recording a podcast, you may not have a limiter on each track. Now you may, but you may just have one on your master. Sort of just depends on what you're doing. There's nothing wrong with having a limiter on the source, right? Just so each person doesn't go over their levels, okay? So I'm not doing much here with this limiter. And as we saw previously, think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating. As I pull that down on this limiter, which is how most limiters are going to work, the overall sound, the overall level sort of goes up and it gets compressed even more. And then we set our ceiling right here. Okay. So in this case, we don't really need that much, just maybe about there. And we have about a -1 dB ceiling on this. Think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to. Now here in Pro Tools, if you prefer to use a chain of different plugins, okay, we could of course create a track preset for that and just recall that whenever we want to use that specific chain with all of our settings already set up and ready to go. In Studio One, you could create like an effects chain and just drag that in, and you would have all of your plugins set up and ready to go that way. Now, lastly, there is, of course, another way we could do this besides Nectar or besides separate plugins is you could use a channel strip. Now, Nectar is essentially a channel strip, but you could use other channel strips as well. A lot of channel strips have, basically all of our tools built in. So here we have, again, the same exact track, and I've already set it up here, in this case, using our Schoeps Omni channel. Okay, so bypass it. Think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. Then turn it on. Think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain. All right. So again, the same overall sound as the Rogan podcast. What we're doing here in this one, we have a little bit of pre-saturation on this, just a tiny, tiny bit. And then for our low end that we're cutting out, I'm using our filters over here. As you can see, we're cutting out with our high pass there. Again, around 130 or so to cut out that low end, 12 dB per octave, as you can see right here. Then over here, we have our gate. Again, don't have to use the gate if you don't want to, but we have it turned on and set, about -50 in this case. Set up your floor, your close, your attack time, your release. The same settings we saw in Nectar 3. Then we have a de-esser right here. Now in this case, I'm using two different de-essers at different areas. So if we listen here, we're sort of using a peak here to pull some of that out, and then using our sort of shelf to pull out that really high end there. And then I'm pulling in a little bit of level because we're sort of dipping down with our de-esser here. And then over here to the EQ, same stuff essentially. High end, we're pulling some in here around 77, 7.7. And then the mid here, we're pulling again in this 312 area. We're pulling some up with a really wide band, which again is the same thing that we did up here on Nectar 3, right up here in this area. Okay, that's what we're emulating down here with our channel strip. In this case, again, Omni channel. And then same stuff here. We're pulling out some around 1,000 or so. Okay. They're not really doing anything for the low end here because we've already filtered it out over here in our filter. And then we have a compressor on this, which is already included in the chain. We're just using one compressor. In this case, we're using a VCA because it's really fast and it's really transparent. Think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest. So the FET is a little bit thicker overall. It sounds good, but it's not the exact sort of sound. We could also use optical, which sounds pretty good as well. It uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world. So when you have ideas, whether ideas that turn out to be art or music, of course, we're pulling in some more of that makeup gain down here, about 3 dB in this case. And of course, our ratio, our attack, and our release. Then there's also a limiter built into Omni channel, which there is to a lot of different channel strips. If you're using an SSL channel strip or something like that, it's going to have different options, but it's all basically the same stuff. All right, so a bit of a limiter on that, just about, again, -1 dB, just to make sure we're not clipping or anything. So hear that one more time. Off these ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. On these ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. All right. So again, same sort of sound we get up here.
These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating.
Back to Nectar 3. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. Back to our chain of plugins. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. And then back to our channel strip here. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. Okay, so that is emulating that Joe Rogan podcast sound, how to get that podcast sound with your Shure SM7B. All right, so lastly, as I said at the beginning of the video, I'm going to show you two more plugins now that's going to take your audio to the next level and sound even better than this. What we're going to do is we're going to get rid of clicks and pops and background noises and stuff like this here. All right, that's annoying because it lives all across this audio.
You think of them as something your brain's creating.
Okay, now in our example, because I was in a rather quiet room and I'm using a cloud lifter, so I'm not pegging my gain out all the way, it's already pretty quiet, right? Think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. right? But there's still some of that background noise in there, as you can probably hear, even though we do have a gate on. So you might not actually be able to hear that. If I bypass that, we can see it right here, that noise. Okay. So if you don't want to use a gate, this is another thing you could do to get rid of that background noise so it's not shutting off on you, okay? We can even take the gate off if you want, but just turn it off for now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this down a little bit because we want these two processors to be above our compression and our EQ and all that stuff. So the first one is going to be from iZotope. Actually, they're both going to be from iZotope. We're going to use the RX Mouth D-Click. Now, I would actually usually use this as the audio suite version and just render it to the track, but we can also set it up here on an insert as well. Now, there's some clicks in here, which you might not be able to hear unless you're wearing headphones, but you can kind of see them in here. You kind of hear them a little bit. Maybe make sure this is bypassed. Right, some clicks in there. So let me turn this on and you'll actually see the clicks down here being repaired. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your, right? It's getting rid of some of those clicks that are actually present even up here that you can.
It's creating it.
Yeah.
But maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it
Right here.
create it so that it
Hear that?
create it so that it can create it so that it can create it so that it.
So what I would usually do actually, at least a lot of times, is I would just go to the audio suite version here and then grab our D-Click, mouth D-Click. Here's the audio suite version. I can hear that audio that we have selected here.
Create it so that it can create it so that it can create it so that it.
Right, repairing those clicks. If I just hear the clicks here, all that mouth noise. Pull this up a little bit.
It can create it so that it can create it so.
Render it. And now,
To create it so that it can manifest it.
right, Control Z, hear it again.
Create it so that it can
Hear that?
create it so that it can create it so that it can
Again, render it again.
create it so that it can to create it so that it can
Much, much better. I'll actually Control Z out of that. All right, but that's one thing you can do is, the audio suite method of actually rendering that to just the portions where you happen to have mouth clicks. But if you're doing this live, you can actually use this plugin live if you want. Just have it on your track, and whenever you're sending it out, whatever you're using, if you're using OBS or whatever, okay, you could have that hosted in there. But here's the real-time version again. Let's solo this track and bypass it. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, there's some clicks right here. Your brain's creating. Turn it on. Your brain's creating. And maybe your brain is creating it. Move this, adjust it a little bit. Your brain's creating. And maybe your brain is creating it. But maybe it uses your much, much better. So that is plugin number 1, RX Mouth D-Click. Absolutely love this plugin. I'm gonna turn it off for now. But the next one we're gonna use, everybody needs this one here, okay? So it's gonna be iZotope again. So let's grab iZotope and we're gonna go with RX7, in this case, Voice Denoise. Now this one is gonna get rid of all that background noise that we happen to have in there. And the great thing about this plugin is you really don't have to do much. Just leave it on adaptive, dialogue, surgical. You can probably leave all this alone too. So I'll bypass it and again, listen. These ideas, even though you think of them as something so you hear that background noise. Now again, we have our gate turned off right now on Nectar, okay? So we're gonna clean this up this way here in these little sections. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, isn't that much better? Let's come up, say up here. Hear this background noise here? You zoom into that. Just pressing the T key there. So turn it on. Look at that. We've pretty much taken it away. Went from that to that. We can, of course, adjust our threshold and reduction just a bit. We don't want to take it all the way up, right? That's not going to sound natural on our audio. These ideas, right? So just about the defaults usually work. And that noise you're hearing in the background is a computer, because I have a computer right next to the microphone as I was recording that. So if you have an air conditioner on, or maybe a fan on, you're definitely gonna need this. If you have your preamps, pegged out to 10, you're definitely gonna need this. Okay, this voice denoise. Okay, so there you go. That's the 2 other plugins that's gonna take your audio to the next level: RX mouth declick and RX voice denoise. Because there's so many people out there that have noisy audio, and they don't need to. We could even do it on this track here, and you'll really hear it here. If I find my iZotope plugins, and we'll go for voice denoise. And before we go, I'll show you a couple other options if you don't like iZotope. Okay, so we'll bypass it here. Again, I didn't touch anything in here at all. I didn't adjust anything. We'll just play back again. Listen to that high end sound.
These ideas, even though you think of them as
right. Just turn it on.
These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. Yeah. But maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world. Yeah. So when you have ideas,
right, we're not losing fidelity of our audio. The level difference is only 0.1. As you can see, in is -3.6, out is -3.5. So it's not really doing much at all to the overall level. We're just sort of getting that background noise out. Okay, and it sounds, in my opinion, it sounds much better. So this area right here is just silence essentially, but there's still some of that preamp gain noise and background noise in there. Bypass it. You can hear all that there. Turn it on. It's about silent. Much better. As I said, if you don't like the iZotope plugins, no problem. Check out some from Waves, and I have a different video on this already, but I'll quickly mention NS1, and there's also WNS. We'll go for WNS first here, and we'll just hear it on this track. Start with a bypassed.
These ideas, even though you think of them,
and turn it on,
as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. Yeah. But maybe it uses your brain. Okay,
so that does pretty well. And another option would be W43, which doesn't do quite as good of a job. It doesn't lower things quite as much, but you can use it. You can try that one if you want. But the other one would be NS1, which is really simple to use. You just dial it up a little bit here, and you're pretty much good to go.
These ideas, even though you think of them,
bypass it,
as something your brain's creating,
and turn it on.
Of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. Yeah. But maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world. Yeah. So when you have ideas, whether ideas that turn out to be art or music, like Jimmy.
Right. So there's NS1 there as well, and that will of course take your productions, your podcast, to the next level, because you won't have noisy audio like everyone else. So again, we have RX7 voice denoise on our track, and this is the Nectar 3 track. Gate is off right now. So last time, these ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world. So when you have ideas, whether ideas that turn out to be art or music, all right. So again, that gate is optional, as I said up top, but I usually like to use one, and I'm not too aggressive with it. All right. And we'll hear the other track here, down here. Again, our chain of plugins. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it. And our channel strip, Shep's Omni channel. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. And maybe your brain is creating it. So on this one, of course, we would want some sort of denoising. So I'll pull that down one level. And we'll just grab something from Waves. We'll just say let's go with WNS actually. And we'll just play back. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world. So when you have ideas, whether ideas that turn out to be art or music, all right. So there you go. That's how you can get that Joe Rogan podcast sound, either with Nectar 3, your very own chain of plugins, or a channel strip style plugin, and a couple other plugins that are going to take your podcast to the next level. Again, mouth declick, voice denoise, NS1, or WNS from Waves.